Yes, it
Okay.
is.
Okay. It being 6 p.m., I will call to order the meeting of the planning board at Swansea Whitcomb Hall, June 23rd. I will begin with the roll call. Scott Self, Chair, here. Michael York.
Here.
Jane Johnson.
Here.
Michael Day. Brandon Self.
Here.
Richard Lane. Bill Hutwelker. Steve Malone. Murray Gallagher. Okay, and we have a quorum, so we can continue with the meeting, even though we don't have any alternates here. And let's see, the agenda for this evening is mainly just to review and approve the minutes of June 9th, 2022, and discussions and other business. We have a voluntary merger. Randy and Deanna Phillips wish to voluntarily merge a piece of property. And we have a Conservation Commission workshop on the groundwater protections for site plan review regulations and discussions on site plan review regulations in general and any other business as may be required. First item, regional impact vote. We really don't need to do that because there's nothing on here anyway for an agenda item, so we can skip that part of it. That brings us to the review and approval of the minutes of June 9th. Does anyone have any discussions or changes to those minutes? If not, then a motion is in order. Okay, motion by Michael York to approve the minutes as presented, seconded by Jane Johnson. Is there any further discussion? And all those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed? And they are passed. The first order, let's get the voluntary merger. This is a voluntary merger, and generally what we do is we have a motion that authorizes the chairman to sign the voluntary merger.
So I don't have that.
Louder? Okay.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes,
I don't have anything about a voluntary merger on this agenda.
it's not on the agenda. We could postpone it unless there's a huge rush. We can postpone it till the next meeting. I penciled it in. It came in. Is there a big rush on it? Then let's table it until next meeting because it wasn't on the printed part of the agenda and there's no rush on it. So we will do it at our next meeting. So generally what we do is we just have it as an agenda
Okay,
item.
thank you.
And the planning board either authorizes the chairman to sign it or not. So we will table that until next meeting. And that brings us to Conservation Commission workshop, groundwater protection for site plan review regulations. And I see the Conservation Commission is here, and why don't you just come up to the table and let's run through some of this stuff.
Plenty of room.
Oh, we do, okay. Yeah, we will. Michael Day is on Zoom. He is
Oh,
joining the
yeah.
meeting on
Oh,
Zoom.
okay, good. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, still, let's see, I guess we have, 1, 2, 3, we do have a quorum, but shall we appoint Wally as a?
Yes.
We need a vote to do that?
Yes.
Yes, all right.
Of course we should.
Acclamation. Be seated for who?
What's that?
Who would he be seated for? You have to seat him for a
Rob.
full member.
Robert.
Who's missing?
Yeah, Bob Goodrich is.
Bob Goodrich.
Who is?
Bob Goodrich is not here.
Oh, that's good. Okay.
It's called me Bobby.
You're in. Thank you for coming.
Oh, you're an alternate? Wally, is that it? Is that what you
Yes,
guys are
he
just
is.
doing?
demoted.
Oh, you got demoted for
Self-promotion. He still comes to all the meetings, so what's the difference?
All right.
I'm keeping the same salary though, so it's a good opportunity.
Yeah, us too. Yeah, you can't give that kind of money up.
So shall we introduce
So I
ourselves?
was just gonna say, yeah, let's do that. We just did the roll call for us, but yeah, introduce the Conservation Commission and
Well, I'm Sherry Domina. I'm the new chair, relatively new chair. I don't know, it's been 3 or 4 months, I think.
Jay Ward.
No, no, I am.
Bud Windsor.
Cassie Eaton.
well, welcome to the planning board meeting, our workshop here to maybe get something done on the aquifer protection. I don't know if if any of you had a copy of the site plan review regulations prior to this or not, the planning board's regulations, but that's what we're looking to put some of this stuff into, because part of that is covered under our purview, under the RSAs of the planning board. With those regulations can protect groundwater that way. So if not, do we have a few extra copies of it? There are a few extra copies on the table there of
Of
our
the site plan review?
regulations, yeah. And we have. And we're kind of looking for places where the regulations lack, you know, what we haven't already covered with the zoning and site plan review regulations. And to add things in there, because we're going to be going over the regulations, planning board site plan review regulations from time to time. And this is one of the times we're going to do it, and we're going to add other stuff in there and this stuff too.
So are you, then you're saying you're in the process now of reviewing the regulations?
Yeah, we've been reviewing them, like at the end of the meetings, we've been going over some of the stuff in site plan review regulations. And when we get some stuff together, we will have a public hearing on adopting the regulations, and the planning board adopts them. They don't go in front of the town or anything like that.
I'm wondering if we can have a little bit of background maybe, because so Sarah sent us the I think it was 2017 document. What was it called? The source water. The source water protection thing, and I noticed that there was a couple of recommendations in there.
You can come up, Barbara. We're all sitting at the table just discussing this whole
But
thing.
there's no room.
There's another seat right there.
I don't bite hard.
So some of the recommendations in there were to, I'm just looking at management of risk here, restrict or prohibit hazardous land uses through a municipal zoning ordinance, which this could be this one, site plan review. Educate property owners near public water sources and maintain a source water protection committee. And then you've got 7.1 says adopt a groundwater protection ordinance. So I was looking at and the ordinance that had been drafted, which I think was back in 2018, was that right?
Yes.
Yeah. That was not adopted. And then I also have this list that I think Beverly put together, comparisons, and this was back in 2018 between the existing ordinance at that time and this proposed groundwater protection ordinance. So there was a list of things that had been missing or that were.
That's in the packet.
It is, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm just wondering about a little background, because I wasn't here for all this. You know, why you did not adopt the groundwater protection overlay district.
Because a lot of those things had already been covered in our current zoning, you know, for the districts, all the districts of the town. So that's why it wasn't added in there. We added it into as a addendum to the master plan instead, which is where it still is in there.
So this proposed ordinance would have created another sort of overlay of zoning
Exactly.
on the town.
Yeah.
How is that taken care of now? I guess, is it just really piecemeal?
Well, how is it? I would ask, how is it not taken care of? You know, what problems do we have that we haven't covered? That's what we're trying to do here tonight. What
Yeah.
don't we have covered under our current zoning? We have a lot. And I know, yeah, the planning board deals with the zoning all the times, and other boards don't have to deal with it all, but there's a lot of stuff in the zoning that is already covered and protects the groundwater in town.
So-
And we're just trying to fill in the blanks or fill in the holes that aren't covered yet. Barbara, go ahead.
Well, for example, the gravel pit, Mitchell, it's not something else, but anyway, everybody knows which gravel pit I'm talking about on Route 10.
Yeah.
Okay. So they were proposing to put fuel storage. And fortunately, it was in the Winchester portion of the gravel pit. And they have a groundwater ordinance that prohibits fuel storage over a certain capacity. And so they weren't able to do it because of their groundwater, and it actually was protecting the groundwater in the river at that point by being enforced in the town of Winchester. But if they had proposed to put it in Swansea, there's no way we could have defended it. Because we have no ordinance that says, that it's not allowed in terms of groundwater resource.
No, it doesn't. No, but we do have protections about above ground storage tanks. It's not that every storage tank is going to leak and pollute the ground.
No, but all you need is one, like we had at Mr. Mike's.
That's right, but you could pollute the ground with a smaller size. What is it, 622 gallons, something like that?
Right.
So on their ordinance, that can do the same thing, but the thing is that the tanks are, actually, that type of installation is controlled by the state. I believe those regulations are at the state, but we all follow those regulations. But yeah, they haven't proposed to put it on the Swansea side then, I guess, because we haven't seen anything like that.
No, that's what I'm saying,
Yeah.
because their location happened to be in the Winchester portion. So I saw it because it was a river issue. But I'm just saying, if it had been in the Swansea, there was little we could do about it.
Little we could do as far as having put there, but a lot we could do as far as regulations go, as far as the tank is, what it is.
As you say, Scott, it is regulated by the state. And so, yeah, they have all kinds of things about, containment and everything. But those are, you're hoping that those work. But if they fail, then you're in deep trouble, like we were with Mr. Mike's. People at the trailer park had problems with their groundwater, with their drinking water, because of that spill. And, so it's not like we're saying you can't put a tank anywhere in the town. It's just in the areas that are most vulnerable in terms of drinking water. So that would have been a situation where if it had been in Swansea and we had the groundwater ordinance, the effect would have been the same in terms of.
True, but there's a
But
lot of ifs there.
It's just,
if
all I'm saying is that we don't have all of the provisions in place that I'm hearing you say that we have.
Well, you mean we don't have all the provisions in place to restrict and deny a lot of things? Is
To
pretty much what we're saying.
protect.
Well, that too, protect, deny, I guess
I
the
mean,
same
is
thing.
that the
using it
same-
way.
Is that the debate, protect versus deny?
Well, there's, like Mitchell's down there, but there's development in town that will and has to, grow. The town has to grow and development has to grow along with it.
Right.
And you can restrict certain things and you really shouldn't restrict other things, restrict them as much as you can, but to keep things safe, but you can't really go by, well, if this happens or if that happens, because
Well, that's
anything could happen.
That's what regulations are for though, right? So let me just ask, so if somebody comes to the planning board with a proposal to do something that could potentially impact the groundwater, and they're in this, what might have been the groundwater overlay protection district. What happens then? I mean, do you go, not being super familiar with the regulations, do you go to some sort of map of the town and say, well, you're over the aquifer, or you're in, I know you have some wellhead protection areas, but do you go and look at a map and say, gosh, you're over the aquifer, is there anything that is stopping them from putting in a great big underground tank or doing some sort of activity that involves potential chemical spills? What stops a business from doing that over the aquifer right now, if they're not in these wellhead protection areas, but they are in the groundwater overlay district?
Nothing probably stops it, other than what's in our regulations. It goes to the Conservation Commission first for a review and overview and opinion, of course, and then that comes to the planning board, and the planning board takes that into consideration for the site plan review. And as long as if they're putting in a tank or whatever they're putting in, as long as it is to the state standards for tanks anyways, double wall and testing and everything, it's okay, it goes in.
So essentially, you're
This
saying.
gentleman had a question, just a second, Barbara.
Jay Ward again. Scott, I'm also new to the whole process, so bear with me. So if I understand there's some reluctance on your part to have more regulation than is necessary. That's what I'm hearing from you, at least.
Mhm.
What are the consequences of delineating the areas that were shown on the map that was in the packet, that are the areas that certain water districts pull water from and that people depend on for their water? What are the downsides of having a ordinance that would require businesses or whatever that is trying to modify a site or build on a site or do something on a site? What are the downsides? Let's talk about if we have a regulation that requires them to get an exception or some sort of special variance for that activity. You know, it seems to me that we in this era and where water supplies are going to be increasingly important, we need to do more than hope that we protected the water. We need to try to be overly protective, and that's just where I'm coming from. Can you speak to what's the downside of having a regulation that would make it harder for somebody to do that?
Well, I'd rather speak to where we don't have it protected. You know, what in our regulations, if you had an example of a company or whatever it is going in there that our regulations are lax about and that could potentially destroy or ruin our groundwater, that's what I'm approaching it from, to change our regulations and to fine tune our regulations there to take care of all of that. Because again, there's a lot of stuff in our regulations that prohibit pollution in general, and not only groundwater, but air and smoke and so on and so forth.
All right, so just to follow up on that, suppose a proposal comes, I don't know what it would be, but it comes to us on the Conservation Commission, and we are adamant that this poses a risk to the groundwater supply, specifically in some of these areas that are delineated here. How much weight does that carry at the planning board?
It carries a lot of weight with the planning board. It has in the past I think it goes over by Swansea Lake, but anyways, it carries a lot of weight, and the planning board can, if you have information to back it up, you know, evidence to back it up, the planning board can deny on those grounds. It's not that it's going on deaf ears and that we don't have any regulations and that we have to let them go through. If the Conservation Commission agrees and says that such and such will probably happen, or this will happen, or it'd be a better place to put it over here or whatever there, that comes into consideration by the planning board.
And but the zoning board might already have approved it because it met the zoning regulations.
The zoning board may have approved it for a special exception for a use, but they didn't approve it for a site plan. The
Okay,
planning board approves for
this
a
is where
site
I'm
plan.
getting educated here. So thank
Okay,
you.
so then the site plan has either restrictions on the company, whatever is going in there, or they out and out deny it on those types of grounds. A lot of things planning board can do there, depending on, you know, what the company or what the business is going in there.
But the planning board is limited by what our ordinances say. And basically what I'm hearing is that you feel that the state regulations are adequate because that is the overarching rule that.
We're talking about storage tanks now, right?
Well,
Specifically
storage
storage
tanks or
tanks.
whatever. I mean.
Well, storage tanks, I do think that they are, but you don't think that they're adequate because of what?
Well, I'm not saying that, I'm just saying that even with the safeguards that you have in place in the case of storage tanks, that there's always the possibility of failure. And so the safeguards that you have for a storage tank on an up and dry parcel might be okay, because if they should fail, it's not going to be as impacted as somebody who has their drinking water right there. And so it's kind of going one step further to protect drinking water resource. And we know, look at what happened with PFAS. I mean, we know that federal government, state governments, they think that they're protecting to the degree that they need to, but then years later, we find out maybe they're not. We think that, what the provisions they have for gasoline storage was adequate, but what happens when it actually leaked? So it's just talking about the groundwater, the drinking water, which is such a critical resource for individuals in this town, and trying to protect that and going maybe one step beyond. And underground storage tanks are, or even above ground storage tanks are one item. But again, it's pinpointing the aquifer. It's not the whole town. It's pinpointing and making those safeguards.
But it's also saying that the water in the aquifer is more important than the water supplying, say, 10 houses in a well somewhere else. If you're going to have whatever regulation is you're talking about for storage tanks, or ban them completely, you should be, but you should be concerned about including just one person's well or including the aquifer on the same page.
No, they're not the same.
They might not be the same, but they kind of are the same because it's water.
It's water, but what happens, how vulnerable that water is.
But
is
you're
the
putting in
difference.
importance, you're putting in importance on the aquifer more so than, say, my well or your well or something else like that.
Because it is more vulnerable. The aquifer is more vulnerable and it moves faster. I mean, somebody who has a, well, mine is a shallow well, so I'm vulnerable, but, somebody who has a well that goes,
A bedrock well.
bedrock that goes hundreds of feet down, is at a different level than somebody who's using the aquifer that's circulating through. Plus, it moves. It doesn't just, it's not just right there in that particular parcel. The aquifer moves, the groundwater moves.
So we're talking about then mainly storage tanks, I think now is what we seem to be talking about as far as.
I just brought that up as an example.
I know, but it's the prime example. It's what everyone would think about when you're talking about, the aquifer is being included. I would think about anyways, especially with the MTV one up there. And
That
Or Earth
was,
used to be.
that was bad, but
Yeah.
if I might say, we also have to think about what they're using in their businesses and homes. And the runoff from what they're using, or it might be liquid, it might be fumes, or it might take years to gravitate down to the aquifer. But we have to look at that too, more than just storage tanks, because say a guy who's about 500 feet off the riverside changes his oil in his truck and goes out to the edge of his garden and dumps it 250 feet from the river and 250 feet from his driveway, but all the same, it's going to go in the moisture in the ground and down and gravitate to the river or the aquifer, whatever he's over. So you got to think more than just storage tanks and storage towers and generators. People need to be educated as to how to use the resources they have. And one resource we darn well better protect is water, because it's essential to life. And
All the rules and regulations in the world might not stop that one person from going to the
No,
edge of his
but
garden and dumping the oil out.
if we did have better enforcement of our regulations and rules, it might.
Or just the education you're just
but-
talking about, the education
Yeah.
to send out, because you're right, the subsurface septic systems, every private septic system, anybody can dump pesticides or whatever, when they're done with it, they dump it down their sink to say, it's going like that, but Right, it
But
does
it's not
seem to
just
be
one
that.
person. There are a lot of people who do that and they don't give it a thought. So education is really important. And part of that education would come through having an overlay and an ordinance, because people don't come out to be educated. Bev and I on Conservation Commission certainly learned that very quickly. And we tried to have programs and have people come in from the public, and we sat and looked at each other. But if it's written in the things that they see, what they have to have for a site plan, then they have to read it, then maybe they'd be more educated that way too.
They wouldn't
were
be.
required.
They wouldn't be, because you're talking
No.
mainly about private citizens, you know, and every day
Well,
Joe
private
changes his
citizens
oil and that type of stuff. Those
Well-
private citizens don't come before the planning board. for
That
site plan.
wasn't really, yeah, I think this didn't really apply to residences. I mean, what you're saying
It
is
can't.
certainly
The
true.
planning board cannot. They
But
can't
and
control
what
residents.
what you're saying also is if you had an overlay so that people knew that they lived in the aquifer protection district, there was such a thing.
Oh, most of them probably don't even know what an
That would help.
aquifer is,
Yeah,
Well, on that side of it,
or
you know,
think about it.
letters to the public who might be in that area, sent out to them from the town from time to time, or Conservation Commission from time to time would help that. But as far as regulations go, you know, the planning board doesn't have purview over single-family residences. It's just businesses that come up before us. So that's what we're
Well,
trying to,
getting down to
fix those holes.
businesses,
Yeah,
then
that's what we're trying to do.
maybe we need to lean more heavily on DES too, to get out and inspect some of these businesses, because in reading our study that was done, there are businesses right here in Stone's Throw of us who do not have permit from DES to be doing the things they're doing. And they're very close to our water system, even the close to West Swansea wells. And they haven't bothered to be
Yep, down on Route 10
licensed.
corridor, yeah. I know what
There's
you're
about
talking
5 of them.
Yeah, but most of those ones are official inspection stations, and those get, the state troopers goes to those places
Well,
and
and-
inspects those.
We need to educate them too then, because that is terrible. And a lot of them have salvage and stuff sitting around for years. They're really close to the town wells.
Well, the education is just one part of it, really, but we're trying to figure out what we're lacking in our zoning or in our site plan review regs that we could put in there to help prevent something like that from being in or regulate something going in prior to that. The education can come anytime or now, or we don't need a regulation for that. We can just do it. But what we're trying to figure out is where there might be some holes in our zoning or in our site plan regs that we can patch in for things like the tanks or whatever we're talking about.
So maybe it'd be instructive to look at the list of things that Beverly pointed out that
Yeah,
are
yeah,
different
let's talk
between
about
the proposal and what the actual.
Mhm.
it was a long time.
It was a long time ago, it was
Yeah.
2018, but
Yeah.
that's, you
Still
know,
relevant.
if we don't include COVID, that's just yesterday.
Yeah.
Just a couple of comments regarding the history is that I think when the team was last organized to study this and put together an ordinance, roughly, I think it was, we found that approximately 50% of the communities in New Hampshire had underground, had regulations like this. And maybe it's the same now, it may be higher. But 50% of the communities in the state of New Hampshire, there's a lot of people. So what do they know that we don't know? Why
Or-
don't they see this as a problem of regulation as opposed to what some of us here feel? So it looks like we got three things in front of us. First of all, I think everybody in this room wants to protect the border. There's no doubt about that.
No doubt about it. Yeah.
Question is, how do we do it? So there's three opportunities. One is do nothing. If we do nothing and just go along, the town is growing. The exposure to the aquifer system is increasing dramatically. If you don't think this town is changing, drive around,
Well, that's what we're doing here.
So
So
drive
that
around and see
doing
what's
nothing is
going on.
probably off the table now.
See what's
because we're
going
here.
on. I mean, we're losing our rural community. Okay, it's
Absolutely.
going away.
And it's gonna happen, yeah.
Yeah, it's not gonna, so so you get that problem. And one thing that might be considered is that why can't this be offered to the people in Swansea as a warrant article? Why don't they pick and choose? I mean, we're trying to decide for consumers what's good for them. One approach is Band-Aid approach to stopping some of these things.
It's because they elect us to do it.
So, well, that's not, people get, we've got every year, there's like 10 or 15 things that you ask and vote on. So that's not you can't hide behind that. It's, the residents should be given the package that was put together was fantastic. We should all read it in detail. It was a great job.
Which package?
And all you have to do with that is to slap on a put this down and that we can go this, put this as a warrant article for, let's see what the people here feel about it. I spent 8 years as a volunteer working for FEMA. I've seen some of these pollution environments, but we're total surprises. Let me tell you, consumers can get very, very angry. And I hope we have good liability insurance if something happens, because there's, you don't realize how mad people can get when their water is not clean. And it could be a real danger. So I hope we do the right thing. So these are just some things that might be considered. I'm done.
Okay. Well, that's what we're doing here. Again, I bring us back to the point about our zoning ordinance, current zoning ordinance that we have, and I know maybe you haven't had a chance to read over most of it. It's a long document like that thick and stuff, but there's a lot of stuff in the zoning that is good there. It's protective, and we've been relying on it for a long time here, as a matter of fact.
Scott, can you pinpoint where in the plan, the groundwater plan, that you think it's redundant?
Let's see. I can't off the top of my head. So let's,
That's what I'm hearing you say.
you
that
are,
it's
yeah,
redundant.
let's read some of the things here. Actually, I don't know if this is relevant or not from the email from Beverly. If there's anything in there.
That was.
And I think you were going to do that. You were gonna
So
talk
maybe
about
some that's in there.
We're
Okay.
about to start doing that.
I'll read the email from Beverly on her points.
There you go.
I'm gonna read it too.
And I think everybody has it in front of them, I think, anyways. in the
You can't remember
packet,
2018?
No, I can't.
probably.
The smaller packets right there, the final page is Beverly's comments.
So number one, there is no aquifer protection district, which could be added as groundwater protection overlay district. Section 3, general provisions, B refers to liquid discharge. Would a broader category be covered if pollutants were added? I think there are other types of pollutants than liquid, and that is correct. There are, such as those in crystalline or powder form, which if left outdoors and rained on, add waste to the ground. See, section 6, commercial industrial 1D does not refer to the business site itself, only to adjacent or other properties. Yet in section 10A for industrial park, it does refer to on-site prohibitions, why in one but not in the other. In the commercial industrial section, there is no list of prohibited uses such as listed in the water protection ordinance, item 6, page 6. While it might not be necessary to list everything from the water protection ordinance, why isn't there any list at all for the ZBA to refer to? The current ordinance allows the storage of unspecified amounts of petroleum and other hazardous materials, while the water protection ordinance would have prohibited anything greater than 660 gallons in a single tank or 20 gallons for multiple tank systems. I don't see any prohibition in the current ordinance for disposal of solid waste or subsurface storage of petroleum or other hazardous materials. I don't see any prohibition against snow dump brought from outside the town. I don't see any prohibition against specific regulated substances. Number 9, while automotive service and repair shops are expressly permitted, I don't see a statement about junkyards and salvage yards or a prohibition for a hazardous waste facility. And she goes on to say, I apologize.
Yeah,
if I
if I
sound
messed up the
reference.
references, sorry.
That's great. Thank you, Beverly.
Took me a long time to go through that, I should say, in 2018.
Yeah.
I went through the entire ordinance, and I may have missed something, and I may have overstated something, but that was the general gist
Yeah.
of what I gleaned out of it at the time.
Yep.
Where would sludge spreading come in? We were talking about PFAS. Is that considered solid waste?
We were to come in our zoning ordinance. you mean?
Like sludge spreading.
I think it is a solid waste, but we don't have a particular zone that I know of that allows that. I know the state encourages it, but the town doesn't have a zone that has that as a listed use.
Well, is it disallowed if somebody wanted to put it on their farm field?
If it's not a specific use, well, farming is different. Agriculture, they they put manure on all these fields that have aquifers, all behind the treatment plant, all right to the river there. They spread all the time, but they have an exemption, I guess, you know. If you're using agricultural, I suppose you could do it. But the town itself does not allow that as a use. If it's not stated in the zone as a particular use, then you can't do it. It's in our zoning, I'm saying.
But you could do it if you were.
If you're agriculture, you probably could, but again, the town can't supersede the state regulations in that regard. If they say you can do it, then you can do it.
Sure about that?
Well, I am, because we haven't been able to stop any cow manure spreading by the rivers, or anything like that.
You never will.
No, I know you
Well,
don't.
is
Because that's an ignorant
PFAS
product.
being regulated differently now? I mean, that's a problem with this, the sludge, right, is PFAS.
Well, that's one of them.
It's one of them. Is
And-
that
And
something,
the type of biosolids, and there's different grades of biosolids too. that they have.
is that something the state is regulating differently than manure? Do we know anything about that?
Different than manure?
Yeah.
Yes, they do regulate it different than manure. And just recently, the Kelly Farm down in Winchester was applying to the state to apply biosolids to their farm. And they ultimately withdrew their application because of basically, I think, the outcry from most of the people in the area.
Where did they apply to? What was that, an application to the town or to the state, or what was that? To the state? So did the state have a public hearing? And how did that happen? How did it
So
work?
I think it never got to a public hearing in the town because they withdrew their application beforehand.
So
Because
too many
people
people
were
found out
upset.
about it maybe
Yeah,
beforehand?
and there were a lot of questions, and again, there's different grades of biosolids, and, you know, the thing being that, if you're getting it from right here from Swansea, if, you know, Swansea wastewater treatment plant, we know that that's from this area, but we do have some industrial that use our wastewater.
No,
No.
the ordinance doesn't allow it.
Okay, so basically you're getting residential, so that sludge would be a lot different than something coming from a municipality like
Like,
Keene.
yeah,
And even though they have programs in place for industrial waste and, you know, discharges and so forth, you know, there's always stuff out there that you don't know about. But so that's different if you're getting it locally, but then a lot of times what happens is that these are coming from Jersey or from who knows where, these biosolids, and you really don't know what's in there. But the town, and I can't remember, because again, we're going from the perspective of the river, and we deal with the state when we do that mostly. But the town, I'm not sure what provisions they had. Because it had been, I know in Winchester, there have been some biosolids spread, not necessarily in the river corridor, but.
so they must allow it then in Winchester, you think, or they have no
Yeah,
say.
but. You know, I can't speak to their
Yeah, I
actual,
don't know either.
yeah, but yeah, that's a real concern, biosolids, and I'm not sure that this ordinance, I mean, this plan, groundwater plan addresses biosolids. does it?
Yeah, this probably was done before it was a thing,
Well, biosolids.
before it was PFAS was a thing.
PFAS for sure,
Yeah.
yeah, but yeah, biosolids have been around for a
Yes.
while, but definitely before the PFAS. So I mean, it might be worth updating that, you know, in that respect. But I mean, and that could be something that can be explored, exactly what are the regulations in terms of the state, and, you know, but if the town, just like in Winchester, the town had a reg that said you cannot put a tank over a certain size, you know, over an aquifer district. But the state would have allowed it, but the town didn't. And in order for the state to do it, they wanted to be sure that the town was going to pass that. So they wanted the approval of the town before the state would okay it.
You're talking about biosolids again, or?
No, I'm just talking about the whole system of state regulation versus local, and local being more strict than state. And that the state does pay attention when the town has a more strict regulation, like this, they did in this case with the tank.
Beverly?
I just wanted to make sure that you knew, Barbara, that the ordinance that we worked on back then came directly from a template from the state.
Yeah,
And we also, we had Granite,
Andrew Madison from Granite.
Andrew Madison came from Granite something or other to put it together. But what I was going to say was we also looked at neighboring towns.
Hinsdale, we copied that from
No, it was-
Hinsdale.
no, it was Harrisville.
Harrisville.
Harrisville had just passed their water protection ordinance. And so we looked at their ordinance as well. But we started with a template from the state.
Right, right.
So we knew we were on safe ground as in regard to with the state.
Right, right, but I was just talking about whether, you know, the more stringent. you
Right,
apply.
I understand that.
And I'm just saying that in the case of the Mitchell situation, they did. They went to the town and said, you need to get the special exception from the town of Winchester for that. So I'm just saying that we can put in place more stringent protocols, just like the 125 feet that everybody complains about.
Right, right.
That's a more stringent protocol than, you know, the state, and yet, you know, we're able to enforce that when people are.
We're not going to get much help from the state. I'm just looking at a fact sheet that was put out by Environmental Services a few years ago. And it's just, I'll just read a couple of lines from it. NHDEC does not have the resources to ensure that all underground storage systems comply with daily operation and maintenance requirements. Once they install, let alone ensure that these systems are leak-free. So we're not going to get any help from the state. In addition to vapor releases and chronic small spills, larger spills take place during processing of fuels in portable containers. Well-designed operating gas stations incorporate a number of measures to minimize groundwater contamination from risks from routine accident spills. However, given the limits of NHDES oversight and the state-of-art spill prevention technology, local officials need to ensure that appropriate restrictions and oversight are in place at the local level to the extent that communities want to ensure the protection of their groundwater resources. So we're on our own. They can give us a sample ordinance, but you know, unfortunately, once the contamination takes place, it's too late. The game is over, and then the suits, the legal suits come up, and it gets to be really messy. That's where we are, close to it.
Mr. Scott, you know, this list from Beverly, I mean, you know, would you contest any of that? I mean, she's saying where there's deficits, and I was asking you where there was redundancy, which is a little different, but still, starting with the deficits, I mean.
Well, we could go over them line by line and get out the zoning ordinance and just see what we're talking about there on and on. And we can do that just before we do, just getting back to our site plan review regulations, because that's not an ordinance, that's the regulations that the town or the planning board uses to go over site plans. You know, they're in reading in our purpose. This is a copy of our site plan review regulations here. And the purpose of it is of these site plan review regulations is to provide for the safe and effective development of the town of Swansea and to guard against such conditions that would involve danger or injury to health, safety, prosperity by reason of inadequate drainage or conditions conducive to flooding of the property or that of another, and inadequate protection for the quality of groundwater, which that's part of our things we do here, undesirable and preventable elements of pollution such as noise, glare, smoke, soot, particulate, or any other discharge into the environment which might prove harmful to persons, structures, or adjacent properties, and inadequate provisions for fire safety, prevention, and control. So those are the things that the planning board uses and does in site plan review regulations to write our regulations. So what we're looking for is to add some things into our regulations. You know, I've gone over, let's see, it was the actual draft here, and there's one of the provisions, and we could put this into our site plan review regulations under, let's see, it's on, I don't know if you have it, on page 15 or even page 21, I think, 21.3, something like this. This is an example of what I'm talking about. Okay. Under page 21, that covers, that's part of the plat submitted, submission items. And, you know, the owner's name, address, and on and on and on it goes down. It starts on page 19. And up on page 21, it talks about plans showing a stormwater drainage system may be required by the planning board. This is all things that the planning board requires on the site plans. So it's getting back to the groundwater protection part of it. In part of that ordinance, it said for any use that will render impervious more than 15% or more than 2,500 square feet of any lot, whichever is greater, a stormwater management plan shall be prepared, which the planning board determines is consistent with the current revision of the New Hampshire Stormwater Manual, volume 1 through 3. That's in that ordinance, and that can be added into, be more specific to the site plan review regulations, cover something like that. Also, there's the number 1, meet minimum stormwater discharge setbacks between water supply wells and constructed stormwater practices as found within the innovative land use planning techniques handbook for substantial development or sustainable development, sorry, section 2.1. Anyway, those things like that aren't in our site plan review regulations yet, and they deal with the aquifer and groundwater and things like that. We have vague things in, like I just read out of there, but we don't have specific things in there like this. So this is what we're looking for to add into our regulations, things like that. And those two particular could go right in, I think, almost as if they are almost worded as they are. And the
So you're
others,
saying that would go for all districts then?
yeah, I'm
As
saying
opposed to
because
just an
the
operator?
whole town practically is aquifers anyways, but for all districts, it should go like that, because one well, to me, is just as important as all the well, you know, and I know there's a difference between the aquifer and the move and all that type of stuff, but that's the type of stuff that we're talking about there. There are other examples. I just pulled a couple of pages out of the ordinance there. And they had like containers in which, and it was written regulated substances, but you were referring to a list of regulated substances on the CFR something or other, which is like at least 3 pages long, and it's just ridiculous to read. But if we change that, containers in which change regulated to hazardous substances are stored must be clearly visible, visibly labeled in accordance with the local, state, and federal regulations, and must be kept closed and sealed when material is not being transferred from one container to another. Things like that we can put in there as in part of the regulations to apply to all of the site plans for dealing with hazardous things like that.
If you do all these things, you have an ordinance. In theory, if you do all these things, you have an ordinance. I don't see much difference between the two if we hit all bases.
Yes, sir.
And so the challenge of we're providing too many regulatory requirements from a political basis to the community. Well, that's exactly what we're doing. So I'm confused.
Respectfully, Wally, I think that what Scott's proposing might work very well, because as I read the existing site plan review thing, it is too general. And if we can get some specific language from that document, put it in here, it makes this much more specific and more, it helps solve some of the issues. For instance, you know, is it possible that on page 15 where it talks about pollution control, that we could put in the fact that this is not just a nuisance to person, structures, groundwater, or adjacent properties. It should be, make sure it also applies to the site, you know, things like that that was pointed out.
And we can also put in reference to aquifers in general in there, I
Right.
suppose, as well, you know, some kind of
Right.
wording to that.
Maybe some definitions in there and so on, as were in the document that you read, the draft document.
Yeah, I think we have a separate place for definitions, but
Right.
yeah, you know, things like that, or things pertinent and specific to protecting the groundwater can be added into the site plan review.
And
Right?
how about the issue of the size of the underground tanks in terms of the magnitude of possible damage that might be there? Do we want to put a limit on the size of the tanks? Things like that. Those are questions that seem to be certainly within the purview of the planning board to think about. So,
So, you know, as far as storage tanks, I think there's a big difference between putting a storage tank, a gasoline storage tank in an aquifer versus a place that doesn't have an aquifer. You have to agree with me on that, no?
I do.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, they-
So, I mean, so when you're talking about underground storage, I think you really do have to make a differentiation as to whether you're putting it in an aquifer or whether you're putting it in up high and dry.
Or even what about something like a salt sand pile? You know, something like that too.
Yeah, it's another thing that is in those
It
regulations. You're right.
really shouldn't be in an aquifer when there's other places you could put it.
But I think it was talking about what snow storage, or salt and sand pile, like it's down to the public barn, but other places in town, I don't know that we have, unless you're talking about small ones or for just residential use or.
Well,
what do
look
you-
at the apartments that may or may not be coming up next
Right.
to Gamarlos.
By Gamarlos, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the snow, I mean, they're definitely right above the aquifer and they've got their snow storage right there without any specific plan for, regulating the amount of salt that they're using. So not only is there salt in that snow, but there's also any petroleum products that might be, from cars that are emitting those items because they're not well maintained. And those are sitting right there. That snow storage is sitting right there and melting right on top of the aquifer.
But how can we single them out when all of Route 10 is salted and largely salted and oil or whatever dripping off, and they just plow right to the side of the road and it sits right there? Same thing, aquifer is right there. You can single the business out, so you can't do that. But say, the state does do what they want anyways, but I mean, you're saying that you can't, but they can do it.
Well, it's all within what you can and can't control.
Mhm.
And, do you not do something because you don't have control over everything, or do you do what you can to protect? I think this would be the question. If you do have the ability to have some control, some protection, then.
Right, and if it's a new business coming in, you have the ability to.
And we do address those issues on the site plan when they come in here.
Except it didn't with this one.
Well, where else were they gonna put it though? Yeah, you could have made them truck it offsite, I suppose.
But it could have come up with a plan for, the amount of salt that they use, or you could have trucked it off.
And who's gonna regulate that? I mean, what, are you gonna send Mike Jasmine out there to measure the amount of salt that goes in the trucks? That's difficult to do.
No, there are actual programs where people, and DOT actually has a program.
Maybe they ought to take their own message there and stop salting so much on some of their roads.
Well, they do want some.
Some of them, but I don't know.
Not Route 10.
And not Route 32 either, not Route 12 either.
Stuff just dumps right out the bag.
So, things like that, we still do regulate where snow is stored on lots, even though, if there's an optimum place to put it, fine, sure, the planning board, we have talked about that before on different site plans there. But again, that piece down there, the whole thing is, over top of the aquifer, as a lot of things are in town. The whole town is aquifer. The entire sewage treatment plant is over an aquifer, and that entire field that they cover with cow manure is over an aquifer. There's a lot of it around. We test down there. The town tests groundwater down there for leakage and that, and we always pick up nitrates and nitrites from the manure, just seeping right through the ground. It's not from the treatment plant, it's from them. Again, it's pollutant, but nothing we can do about it. But what we can do about it is things in our site plan review, and I don't agree with the whole ordinance because, my position on that. Well, I know my position on that from the last time. But we don't need to restrict businesses so much, but we do need to use power in certain instances just to rein
So
it in.
that's exactly what you're doing with these changes.
It is, but it is, so.
So I don't see a difference between the two. Half of the communities in New Hampshire have done this. What
Yeah.
do they know that we don't know?
Well,
What makes us so smarter than them?
are they better off than we are?
I
In
don't
what
know.
ways are
Somebody
they?
should look at it.
And what has happened? What has happened in Swansea that is so bad? Because we don't have one that hasn't happened in a town like Winchester that does have one.
Well, if we wait for that to happen,
It's too late.
it's too late.
Yeah, well, I guess it is a waiting game. We're just saying, what do they know or what do they have that we don't? We have common sense, we have site plan regulations, and we do have our zoning ordinance.
Is there, I thought I saw some language somewhere about excessive withdrawals. I don't
You
know.
did.
So
It's in there.
say a bottling company, Coca-Cola decides to come in or Nestle or something and build a bottling plant. Is that possible? Could they do that?
It's possible, but the state has jurisdiction over how much they draw out of our aquifers. Even so as our aquifers.
I can't do one.
Then I think we need to have a town
Because of
discussion about that too, because the state is too lax on a lot
Oh,
of
yeah,
the things they're supposed to be watching over. And it's just, it really gets me when people will say, or we say, whoever said, it is said that, well, DES has to do X, Y, Z. And then DES says, well, we don't have the resources, so we haven't been able to do that. Well, baloney. Then we need to be doing it ourselves because they're just too lax. And for the state to be able to say how much water they can draw out of the aquifer in our community. No, I think we need something to protect our community from something like Coca-Cola bottling. Those trucks they're on the road more than the logging trucks going to Canada. Another thing that burns me up. But really, and like Barbara pointed out, and we know this because we've dealt with it before in our setbacks from bodies of water. If we make our local rule, then that gets their attention and they have to honor that before theirs. So we do need to say something about water withdrawal, I think, or resource use of our resources.
Or a prohibited use in whatever zone we're talking about, or all the zones. A prohibited use would be a bottling plant or
Mhm.
something that withdraws more than whatever figure you're talking about, gallons per whatever.
What about the landscaping companies that take water out of Wilson Pond?
Yeah, I hear about that, huh?
Do they? Yeah.
Oh, they're there all the time.
Yeah.
Big tanker trucks just sucking water out.
I've done that.
It was fun the other day.
Well, it's,
Somebody did it.
but it's holes in the ordinance, like Jane was just talking about, is what we're here to stop up. You know, if that's a concern, bottling plants, which it probably would be a concern, or if a large water company came in and wanted to draw off the aquifers.
So can I ask a question?
Yeah,
I asked a question about item 5.
on your list? was it?
Yeah. What is the downside of putting a gallonage, if you will, limit on the, the amount of gallons that can be, which is, if you had an aquifer protection ordinance, you have those limits. We don't have any limits. What is the downside of putting those limits in place?
Only for gas stations, I would think, with the downside.
I'm talking about the benefit to the town. What, you mean we lose some gas stations? Is that?
Oh, I see, yeah.
Yeah, what is the town losing if we had those limits on storage capacity?
Eventually, they would lose the gas stations if that was the ordinance, and then you'd have to drive to Keene to get your gas. I mean,
Well, all the existing gas stations would be grandfathered. They wouldn't have.
but those tanks don't last forever. They make them take them
They
out
have
every
to
10
pull them out
or
and
15
replace them.
years, whatever it is.
Yeah,
So you're
So-
saying those tanks are normally larger than that?
Yes, they are. Yeah.
Okay.
So when they're taken out, if the ordinance says they can't be put back in again, then that's it for the gas station. They're done. You're shut the business now.
And, the site plan review document here just says that the tank should comply with the standards set forth by New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. And I don't know what those standards are.
They change, they update them all the time.
That's why it's in
That's
there
why it's
that way.
vague like that, because they update them all the
So we have to
time.
look at that and see that, are there no volume restrictions and those regulations? That's what I'm wondering.
Probably not. I don't know of any volume restrictions. The other restrictions are the way the tank has to be built, containment, the testing, the venting.
Yeah.
It's a huge list of things that they're supposed to do. And then there's a checklist that they have to test every month or, I don't know, a few weeks or something that they have to abide to. And then
Mhm.
they check their self-test. I don't think the state comes down and tests it. They might test it, but they check their records. And that's how it's done. And again, it sounds like an accident waiting to happen, but to me, it seems pretty safe nowadays with the tanks and stuff that they have in there. You don't really hear of any of that going, that I haven't anyways, heard of that going on. Spills. The one up to Irv's up there by the trailer park, that was an old tank. That was in long ago, and that was leaking and contaminated that water up there with the MTBE. Now to stop putting it in the.
And that's the issue in the sense that, no matter what regulation you have, the tank eventually is going to get old and maybe leak. So,
It does, but nowadays, you have to change them whether they're leaking out. The ones they just took out Marlins a few years ago, those are fine. No leaks detected, all the ground soil and stuff around it, they tested, nothing detected for leaks, but they had to replace it, which they're all doing because of the liability.
yep,
Those ones that Mr. Mice, I believe, were there when Irv Johnston owned that gas station, because I was a little kid living in Westport. My father used to go there, and I believe all those tanks were from then, prior to the state requiring there be alarm systems put into the gas tanks too. You now have alarm systems.
Mhm.
If there's a leak, it's alarms are supposed to be working in a while.
Problem with gas stations, it doesn't take much of a leak to.
Oh, it doesn't?
Something underground. It
It
goes
doesn't matter
really
what
quick.
tank size there is, could be 1,000 gallons, it could be as bad as a 6,000 gallon tank.
There's a lot of protection that they put into the state regs is the fact that those go in on a concrete pad, I forget what the dimensions are. But those tanks all double and triple walled, and there's an alarm system, and what they're trying to do is, if there is a leak, that the alarm goes off and we get down there and get them replaced and cleaned up before there is an issue like you had down there.
yeah.
That issue down there come from a long-standing burial of tanks,
Right.
which the state ordinances have now changed on that.
Got it. So what you're saying in a lot of ways is that as the state standards change, we're better off each time. So,
Well, hopefully, yes, if we have people at the state level looking at what's happening in towns and saying, wait a minute, this isn't working, we need to change this.
So if there's a business that somebody decides to maybe come in and buy a piece of land, or maybe somebody's already got a piece of land and they decide they're gonna put all kinds of money into developing this business plan for something that's potentially hazardous, let's just say it's a gas station, but it could be a lot of things. And it comes before the planning board and it comes before the Conservation Commission, and we look at the map and say, that's right over the aquifer. Swansea doesn't have a law that says you can't do it, but the Conservation Commission is gonna say, you better not. That person has maybe put a lot of money into developing that without knowing that it was over this aquifer. Would it not be more fair if we had something that they could have gone to on the website to look at this groundwater protection overlay or something to say, maybe I better not put a bunch of money into developing this business here, maybe I should do it over there instead.
Well, first of all, before they put a bunch of money into it, they probably go to the zoning board of adjustment. That's a special exception in any of those areas there. And they'd find out there probably that there's an aquifer.
Which areas though?
Depending on where they wanted to put it, the Conservation Commission would probably get it at that time. Do they get it? Yeah, Conservation Commission would get it then. They'd be able to weigh in on whether there's an aquifer underneath that particular piece of property they wanted to put the service station on. And that would weigh into the zoning board of adjustments decision as to whether it can go there or not. They can deny the special exception there before it even gets to the planning board, before they even put a bunch of money into it. And again, it's buyer beware. If they want to put a bunch of money into it without doing the homework, then that's no problem. They get denied, that happens. Jane? Yeah.
Well, right now, we have managed to have enough members to have a conservation commission, and a good one, people who are really in tune and sensitive to these things. But it isn't that long ago that we were down to almost nothing, and sometimes we couldn't even have a meeting because we didn't have a quorum, we didn't have enough members.
We had a
Or all-
non-meeting meeting.
Huh?
We had a non-meeting meeting.
Yeah, and so we can say the Conservation Commission may catch it and bring it to the planning board, but what if? Are we going to be able to maintain a Conservation Commission? It's really frightening to me as to what's going to happen to our society and our civilization, where you can't get people to take part in things. And so if there isn't anything there that tells them they can't do these things, and there aren't any people to stand up to them, then
Yeah,
So-
we often don't get the time, and this is nobody's fault, but Sarah and I have been talking about this.
Yeah,
In between meetings for the Conservation Commission to properly look at something and have a group discussion about it. You know, sometimes things just happen too fast and our meeting is not till, 3 weeks later. Yeah, we can individually look at it, but we can't sit around and really delve into it. And so it might get past the ZBA. And maybe it gets to the planning board and you guys say, well, we better talk to the Conservation Commission about this, but like you said, maybe not. I mean,
and then I suppose what you'd have to do then would be say, we can't act on this until we hear from the Conservation Commission because it's an issue.
We've had that discussion already about that.
Yeah,
Okay,
recently.
but we should really do that too. and be-
Could that be in these regulations?
Pardon
Could
me?
that be in these regulations?
It'll be on a rules of procedure.
Yeah.
We've got a bunch of notes here that we're changing.
Yeah.
All those notes that you can see in there, we're doing some changes here, and that's part of it. How we address site plans when the Conservation Commission hasn't seen them yet, that we may accept the application as complete, but we will continue it to the next meeting if we don't hear from the Conservation Commission on whatever it happens to be. So that's going to be in our rules of procedure.
I see.
And I have another suggestion. Real quick, I want someone on the Conservation Commission other than myself to be a representative to the planning board because I'm an elected member of the planning board and I don't feel that I should be Conservation Commission's rep on the planning board. We need you. I need you. I think it would be a stronger board if someone from Conservation Commission came to planning board meetings and you could rotate. The selectmen are supposed to have a representative in each of our meetings and they don't send the same guy every time. Somebody comes for a number of months and then somebody else comes. And I think that that would be good.
Selectman representative is per RSA. It's
That is,
dedicated.
but
We
I'm
have to,
just
but the
saying that-
Conservation Commission doesn't have to do that.
Doesn't
You're just
have
saying
to,
that
but I
someone
think it'd be a
voluntarily.
good
goes in.
idea.
And it would be, yeah, be a good idea. It's fine to, especially when we get a report from the commission and there's no one here to answer questions as to, well, why did you guys say this or what's going on with that? You know, that would be helpful. But again, we
I
can.
can't sit in two chairs.
Yeah, well,
I'm not-
Sarah.
Could I just add to Sherry's concern about ZBA and that process? The ZBA application will always miss the Concom meeting because the application deadline for ZBA requests is the first Friday of the month typically. And their meeting is always the third Monday of the month, and your meeting is the first Monday of the month. So those review forms don't go out until a week after your meeting.
Well, they could still have the same rules and procedures that they don't hear an item unless they've heard from the Conservation Commission. You know, if it's delays the applicant for 2 weeks, then it delays them for 2 weeks. They could,
Well, delay
Unless-
them for a month.
a
but-
month, well, even so, you know, if it's something big, then
Yes, and we've had people come to us prior to going to the zoning board or whatever, haven't we?
that always helps.
The Flatley project.
The Flatley
came-
project
they
came
did,
to us
yes.
first.
Yeah.
The Flatley project came to us first. That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
of.
But most of the items that come in are routine.
Yeah,
There's rarely an exception to moving ahead. And I think what Scott was mentioning, if something is of real significance and the common sense looks at the application, then maybe we have to do a better job in trying to be able to talk with each other. You know, something like that might work.
and maybe in those circumstances, we
Something, yeah.
try to send somebody to this
Yeah,
meeting.
yeah.
Without the Conservation Commission discussing it first. is
No,
that
we
what you're
discuss
saying?
it first, but then maybe if we had some concerns, one
Yeah.
of us tries to come to the meeting.
Definitely
to answer
so.
questions.
But the point that Sarah was bringing up was about the ZBA, that
Yeah,
they're always gonna miss your meetings. So again, we don't have any power over their rules of procedure, but might be able to suggest to them that they might want to try that
We can
if they
start a
don't see,
conversation.
if it's something large. But again, it becomes if it's. We had this discussion when we were talking about Conservation Commission and us not seeing their stuff sometimes and postponing it. And who decides whether it's going to be something that the commission doesn't have to look at and does have to look at. So I think we left it that regardless, if it goes to the commission first, then the planning board needs to see the commission's report on it or take on it before, whether it's big or small. So
Yeah.
it probably should be the same thing for the ZBA. If they're fine to it, they make up their own rules, but if they're fine with it, and maybe we ought to have a joint meeting with those guys at some point. So I just suggest that rules of procedure, but yeah, it's a different issue. I didn't realize that timing was off on those. And
And we did have a pretty long discussion at the last meeting about how to work around that and,
And the commission has a lot of weight on the zoning and land use issues. You know, they're not the planning board, but they have a lot of weight. The say of this board, your board has a lot of weight on how the planning board can decide and how they do decide on things. So even if there wasn't an ordinance on board, if the planning commission came in with all the reasons and whatever whatever business we're talking about was going in somewhere, and they go ahead.
No, finish, please.
Okay, and with the reasons why, then the planning board certainly can take that into consideration, and they can deny a plat because of that. Go ahead.
So I was going to suggest that the Conservation Commission members might make themselves familiar with the criteria for granting a special exception and the criteria for granting a variance. If you understand the criteria, what the zoning board has, they're very restricted as to how they can address an application. It has to be based on those criteria. And so, I mean, the Conservation Commission might make comments, but if it doesn't address any of those, the criteria, the list of it, then they might ignore what you had to say and grant something that you don't think should be granted. So if you are aware of what the criteria are and speak to that when you're making your comments, you perhaps will be more successful if you have an issue that is very important to you.
And it wouldn't be as much as that they were ignoring what you're saying. It was that it didn't fit into one of the 5 criteria and that they couldn't take it
That's
into
right, they're
consideration.
constrained by those
Yeah.
criteria. They must
Right.
follow that criteria and nothing further.
So yeah, that'd be helpful. Become familiar with that, just in those cases anyway. But again, with the planning board in the site plan review, that's different. We don't have a specific criteria. We have the whole regulations that we go by. And there's a lot more leeway there, as well as the input from various boards such as yourselves. But getting back to why we're here tonight,
Yeah.
we're looking for specific items, if
Just got to
anybody.
get back to why we're here tonight. That suggestion about bottled water trucks pulling off the aquifer, I think that is one specific thing that could be put into the regulations, because we've seen what happened in Maine with Poland Springs and what they've done, and all that water disappearing from the state of Maine. I think any company who has see what we have as a valuable aquifer would be jumping to try to develop something here, and I think we need to get ahead of that. So that was a good, Jay, I think you brought it up, and it's a good thing to put into this. Regulation we have
Well,
now.
I can tell you, people do look, they are looking at it. They're looking for water everywhere. And someone I know has had a call about water from a company, and that someone would never tell them anything.
So we'd have to put it in the zoning ordinance, not in our rules of procedure or in our site plan regs, because it would pertain to whatever zone that was in it. It wouldn't be able to be put in a residential because there's no manufacturing or processing or anything allowed there. It should be in as a prohibited use in business zone and commercial and industrial probably, as well as commercial, straight commercial. So that's where that should go. And yeah, you said, we don't allow it.
Now, with that, if we're gonna have a company comes in and wants to draw water, are we gonna have a limit, or we're gonna say no? No?
Well, we'd have to look it over, because it might not be. The West Swansea Water Company comes to mind. They're a private company. They're drawing water out of the ground. I don't know how many gallons they're drawing out there, but if we came in with ordinance, it would put those guys as, they could still do it, grandfathered in there, but it would put them as
Restrict them, and then.
a
restrict the draw from
non-conforming,
the area
yes,
too.
yeah, a non-conforming and restrict whatever.
I'm sure there are other towns that have you know,
Water
develop
system.
something. that-
Right.
Yes,
So-
I
but-
think how you worded that would make the difference.
Yes.
How you
between
worded
a
it.
public water system versus a commercial.
Or
Right,
just,
right,
just a
right.
number, a gallon's number, come up with a gallon's number and run it by the town attorney to see if it's legal.
You're talking about a water company that actually supplies the people of the town of Swansea.
Well, we're
with
talking
water.
about, yeah, that's West Swansea Water
Right,
Company, but I'm
right.
just giving them as an example of an
Yeah.
existing company that draws water out of the
Right,
ground.
but that's
But we're
different. They're
talking
not
about
selling
water
it
that
to
would leave Swansea.
Pardon me?
That would go away. In other words, it's trucked, it's pulled out of the ground and it's trucked away and sold commercially. That's.
Well, if we're talking about a bottling plant, yeah, something
Right.
like that. So we have to name it specifically, again, in the zoning ordinance itself.
And you wouldn't want to keep a small brewery from coming in saying,
Yeah.
that's different.
Right.
We're talking about Coca-Cola or
And I
something.
know it looks bad that Jay brought up the hydroseed truck, but that's small potatoes compared to what these guys. plot.
Absolutely.
But we have to differentiate, because if they were to put it in an industrial area in North Swansea, that water would be taken from the city of Keene. Wouldn't come out of aquaculture.
I don't think they want
Just
city
the point,
king.
yeah, right. Probably not.
I don't
It probably
think
wouldn't go in over
Don't
there.
want
No.
city of King.
No.
But you're right, yeah, come on, Industrial Park over here, yeah, I'm right from Keene, yeah. Well, then, you're right, we wouldn't care, because they'd be taking Keene's water.
Right.
Yeah.
So we have, if the Coca-Cola wants to come in, we would restrict them to the industrial area over
There you
North
go.
Swansea.
Yeah, well, we just put that, or not add that as a prohibited use in that zone, that, we're looking at it.
Yeah.
But again, that's a matter, of course, for the zoning ordinance, which again comes up, town meeting, town votes on that zoning ordinance, so that'd have to be added into our
Now,
spring.
if I'm right, Route 10 where Yale Forest owns all the property, we keep that zoned in case we ever get a hold of that property, they want to sell it to us or something along those lines. Is my memory right? We got that zone as commercial/industrial?
I think it's just commercial.
It's just commercial now.
Remember when someone actually who lived in Swansea wanted to dump sludge in the Yale Forest?
Yeah, I do remember that, I forget. who it
So
was,
do
but
I.
remember that,
Hmm,
yeah.
hmm, hmm.
This is a little off topic, but is there any thought way down the road in the future that Swansea might want to have its own town water company? I mean, we have all the
The state has
aquifer.
actually been pushing us to buy.
Correct.
Swansea Water Company because they can't
That's
keep
been
up with
talked
the
about
demands of the
before.
growth.
Right, right.
I-
I'm just saying
The state has
that
not
as,
pushed us
if
to
the
buy it.
population does increase and at some point, it might be better for the town to have control over the use of the water in that way than.
There are
You also get
kinds
all
of
prior
grants.
liabilities
Yes,
too.
I know you do.
Comes along with it.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
The state has informed
Just ask
Swansea
if we had any.
back a number of years ago that there was a lot of debt associated with the West Swansea Company, and that they were constrained from raising their rates because of the PUC.
Yep.
And therefore, the town should just wait until
Yeah.
the company
They
can't
did,
do
when they
business
rolled it,
anymore.
yeah.
That's right, and take it over for free.
Yeah.
That's exactly what the state recommended, not to
I
buy it.
remember she came to one
But then
meeting.
again, we'd have to upgrade it and spend a lot of money.
Came to-
I know what you're talking about, this. That's an experience.
Oh,
Getting back to Scott's charge to all of us, which I think is a good one. I'm wondering if the draft aquifer protection ordinance could be used as something to review to see what we would want to pull out of that that might fit into the,
That's what we're
Things
doing
that-
here, that's why we have it all with us here.
So-
Those are the things I pulled out of there, right?
you know, I haven't taken the time, I'm not smart enough to look at that ordinance and say, oh yeah, this is something we should have.
Now,
I
come
don't
on
know who is
now,
capable of doing that.
we're gonna sign you that job.
Oh,
Because you said
I'm
that.
alternate. I quit.
Yeah, I think we should.
You
yeah.
mentioned a couple of them
It
already.
doesn't-
That would be the source of the information.
Yeah, the information, the items I
Take
quoted were
advantage
out
of the
of
work that
that.
was done, so just not throw it out, you know? See if we can pull something out.
No,
of
that's
that.
what we're doing here, and that's why we have the information here, and yeah, we don't have to confine it just this one meeting. We
So-
can meet again.
We could have a meeting where we could just go through that ordinance and pick out the stuff that, by combining our knowledge, somebody
Yep.
could say, we already have that.
So
Let's go on to the next one.
we're,
Maybe that might help.
with the site plan review regulations, the regulations deal with not specific uses, but regulates, let's see how I'm gonna put it, how the business sets up, I guess. What information that the planning board wants to see when they come in before us. It's not, the site plan regs couldn't, for instance, say, no underground tanks. the zoning ordinance has to say that. But the site plan review reg can say, if you have an underground tank, it has to be this, 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 and this. Those types of things, the regs. So keep that in mind when you're looking through those, the ordinance there, that's what we're talking about here, as far as this goes.
Can I make a suggestion? I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, no, go right ahead.
I don't think it's possible to write things like this by committee, or at least committee this size. I think that, Sarah and I had talked a little bit about going over some of this stuff. I think we should have a small group of 3 or 4 people max. That I think this is a good place to start with Beverly's list here, and expand on it a little bit. We've already talked about a couple other things like the bottling company and the biosolids maybe. Just start writing up changes to the regulations and possibly the ordinance
there-
where that
there-
makes more sense.
Yeah, 2 separate issues, right? The list that we're talking about with Beverly primarily has to do with the zoning ordinance itself.
Mhm.
And what we're talking about this night anyway, are our site plan review regulations. And Wally was saying about just taking some things out like we had read before
Yep.
and putting in there, the things that'll fit in there, because it all won't fit in there because we're restricted as to what we can do with our site plan. regs. But the same, but
Well, how do you
the
want to
same-
proceed, I guess, is my question, because
Well-
I don't think we can get anything done in this size of a group.
Right now, we're working on site plan regs because the planning board can adopt them in a public hearing at any planning board meeting.
Mhm.
The ordinance, that has to be done town meeting, so the planning board gets ordinance stuff when it gets closer to town meeting, public hearings, so on and so forth. So that doesn't have to be done for a while.
Right,
It
but
can
as
still
we're
work.
working on this, if we see, okay, this is an issue that we really want to address, but it doesn't belong here, it belongs in the ordinance. Let's start a list.
Yeah, again, yeah, if you're reading the draft ordinance and you've got our zoning ordinance, we should get a copy of it if you don't already have it. And compare the two, and if we're missing something out of the zoning ordinance, then we add it into the zoning ordinance.
Mhm.
And it might be a big list, it might not be a big list, I don't know, but that's what we could do.
I think what's critical is that if you have a smaller group of people who work on doing exactly that, that there be at least 2 planning board members who are part of that group, because I think that was the big problem with the original groundwater ordinance proposal, is that there wasn't enough participation from the planning board. And it's very frustrating to put the amount of work and effort into a document and then have it just said, well, it's redundant. So if we have someone from the planning board who is willing to participate in that discussion with a Concom member, with the assurance that they are representing the planning board views, or at least can relate the views back to the planning board, so that they're not working in a vacuum.
Or you could put your group together, like you're talking about, of just a few people, and present the things to the planning board that you think the zoning is missing and should be in there from this draft ordinance, and the full planning board can have a discussion like we're doing tonight.
Why can't the planning board participate in this? Because we've already done that.
Yeah, I think it's already here, mostly.
Then, okay, then the planning board can take it from there. If you don't want to do that, it doesn't matter. I don't care if the planning board members want to go onto the Concom and do that or not.
Well, what I'm suggesting is that we,
I have another
Just saying,
question.
Beverly had a point of order.
So zoning ordinance warrant articles come from the planning board, do they not?
That's correct, yes.
The only way the Conservation Commission would do that would be to do through petition.
That's right.
So-
I don't know if they can petition as a board. Private citizen can petition.
So how would the Conservation Commission would then have to convince the planning board to sponsor a warrant article? I mean, I don't understand.
Or just somebody like Barbara takes the thing and gets 25 signatures and puts it on the warrant.
Oh, okay, so
Or anybody
so
that,
it would have to be done
private
by
citizen.
petition.
yeah, do that
If
fine.
the planning board didn't want to offer a warrant article to that effect, then we'd have, the Conservation Commission would do it by petition. Okay, I just trying to clarify in there.
And then
But
you
I don't
always
think-
run the risk of that little parentheses that says not supported by the planning.
Yes, well, that's, yes.
And I don't know if the Conservation Commission as a commission can petition for a zoning change. I think it has to be a private citizen of Swansea to do it.
what I'm suggesting is like, for instance, me and you and Sarah and maybe a couple other people sit down and say, okay, number 2, liquid discharge, where is that not in here? Where does it belong? Or we divvy it up and say, I'll do this one, you do this one, and then we sit down as a group and read it over and say, does that satisfy everybody? Yep. And then the next thing. So then we come up with a document that we feel works for the Conservation Commission and the Planning Board. And then we can move forward with that. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. You mean use Beverly's list as the
It's just a
document
starting
and just
point.
run on
I'm
those?
sure there's more than that.
You know,
And we've
I-
already come up with a couple more.
But I think
A
the,
lot of stuff in there.
the draft of the proposal that came up before has a lot of things in it, so what you mentioned already. And that's over and above what Beverly did, was Beverly was comparing that to zoning,
Mhm.
and this is our attempt. We just need to look at this and see if any of that belongs in the site review. So, I mean, there's more to it than just looking at Beverly's list.
There is from that perspective, again, the site plan review regs are separate from the zoning ordinance.
Yes.
We have to approach them separately.
Right.
And, right, the site plan regs are probably gonna be done before the zoning changes are done.
Right. So I would rather see us focus on looking at the draft plan and seeing what parts of that could be implemented into your site plan review things, and really focusing on that first.
I mean, I think that's where this came from, but you're right, there could be additional things in here that didn't.
Yeah, I mean, I'm reading this as a comparison with the zoning ordinance and not with the,
And this
not with the site
proposed,
plan
and this proposed.
and this proposal.
Yeah.
But this proposal and the site plan review has not been compared,
Okay, I see what you're saying.
and that's what we need to do.
Yeah, that'd work. That's what we're looking for, just input to, as we do our regulations, to put stuff in there to make it better. Take more. So
There's some ideas in here.
I suppose we could have another meeting, or we could all look it over and get back to Sarah on the things that we think should be in there or shouldn't be in there, and the planning board can continue next meeting, or however it wants to be done.
Well,
Or-
couldn't Scott, since you're so well versed in this, more so than any other board member, couldn't you meet with Sarah and Sherry and, point out, this is a good reg, or this seems workable.
I can, yeah, but let's do the site plan regs first, because the
Okay,
zoning
but-
doesn't come until way next
I
year.
agree.
that's
So
what
where
I'm
do we
saying.
start? And I'd like to do it with a small group.
We start with looking over that draft and also looking over our site plan review regulations. So getting the gist of, and you don't have to read the whole thing, but just getting the gist of what the regulations can and cannot require. And taking things from that draft ordinance that we can put in there, like those 2 examples I gave before, we could put in there, and protecting things that way. Again, we're restrictive with the site plan review regulations.
Mhm.
And what can't fit in there, we can possibly put into the zoning then. The second time, so. Again, yeah, just look over our regulations, see what they say, see if they're too vague, or see if something can be more specifically put in there for the aquifer protection. You look puzzled.
Yeah, you're saying look over our regulations, but that seems a little backwards to me. You already seem to feel that there are things that are redundant. And so wouldn't it be easier for a committee to work if you could say, these are the things that I think are redundant, and we don't, and these are the things that I think could be regulations versus ordinance. I mean, I'm just saying you as the resource, and, I just want to hear a
So,
willingness
again-
for you to participate in the process.
I am participating, but again, we're 2 separate things, ordinance and regulations. So ordinance are the things that are redundant in there about the ordinance.
Mhm.
Regulations, not so much, because the regulations are what we're going through now, and we're picking specific things, hopefully anyways, out of that draft
Right.
that we can incorporate into those regulations to have an applicant bring to the planning board when they're bringing a site plan here,
Okay.
and things that they have to abide by. Yes, Barbara?
So I just wanted to make clear that the reason I did this against the ordinance is because we were comparing it to an ordinance
Yes,
or a proposed ordinance.
that's right. yeah.
I didn't look at the site plan regulations. I was looking at what the aquifer protection ordinance would bring to the table versus what we have in our ordinance today, or
Right.
zoning ordinance.
That's
So
right.
that's a clarity. Bringing in the site plan regulations is a whole other ballgame. You have to really work that through. individually.
Yep. And we will, yeah.
Yeah.
Because all of the things we might pick out of the draft may not be able to be put into the regulations because we won't have the authority to pass that and regulate it that way. Yes. So,
Would it be helpful if you marked up a copy of the draft, just crossing out the things that cannot exist in the site plan regulations? Because the planning board doesn't have the authority to add those to site plan regs.
it might make it easier. Yeah, it might make sense.
And
Yeah,
then
I
I
could do
can
that.
share
Yeah,
that
Yeah.
with the group. So
Okay.
there's a jumping off point.
That's a good suggestion.
'Cause
That's
you
right. We
know,
wouldn't be wasting our time reading through the whole thing and finding out that it can't go in there. Yeah. Yeah, okay, we'll do that.
But they could go into a zoning ordinance.
That's right, and we'll
Yeah.
do
So
that.
you make
it'll
the
be separate,
distinction. You
yeah,
can't
two
go
lists.
here, but you
Yeah.
could do it here.
Yeah.
So that the group would know the distinction between the two.
Or if you think we've already have it, you know, you can make that comment too.
Right.
you
Well,
know.
yeah, I probably should have kept the other one back in the day when we did this whole thing, as I had notes all over the thing, as where I thought we had it covered, didn't cover it, so.
You know,
I don't, but doesn't mean I can't do it again.
okay.
So is
So-
there anyone from the Conservation Commission that's particularly interested in working on a small group? You would, Jay? I would like to as well, but I can't probably attend to it till like September, October.
And that's fine, because if it's ordinance stuff, that's about when we're getting ready to. whoopsie,
Well, I mean,
ready to
I'm, you know,
work
we're
on
gonna
it.
start with the regs and I'd like to help with that too, but
Oh, you won't be able to be involved with the site plan regs?
I would like to try, but this is my really busy time of year, so.
Well, still, Sarah can send you stuff,
Yes, I
email, and
can,
you can comment on them. and-
I can do that.
And she can bring
I
your
can do
comments
that.
back to the board if
Yeah.
you can attend.
I can do that.
Okay.
I can attend meetings. I'm just saying I can't like spend hours thinking about it till, I don't have hours until like
Multitasking.
October.
Okay,
But yes, I'm definitely interested in working on it, so thank you.
Just a comment, this is a very encouraging meeting. It looks like we're going to do something with this. It's not gonna be easy work, but it looks like we're going to be doing something that's going to really benefit the town. And I'm really encouraged by what I hear.
we're always moving forward, right?
Yep, yep.
No, I appreciate you meeting with us and I
Well, we're
appreciate
glad you
everybody
came.
coming.
Yeah, yeah. We need more discussions like this to just get things done, and everybody won't be happy at the end of it, but everybody won't be sad either, you know. I'm sure we'll get stuff in there. What are you laughing at?
Well, if not everybody's happy, you needed some right, so.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. So I guess then I'll go through the draft and just sort of mark things up that cannot go into our site plan regs because of, I can. And we'll start from there, and then Sarah can just email everybody copies of what we're doing. We can get going on it, and I don't know. Next meeting, I won't be here, so maybe you ought to meet instead of, you know, I won't be at the next meeting, but we ought to have another meeting again when we get all this stuff together and just decide on it. And then the planning board after that will decide officially what is and isn't going into the site plan regs, and then they'll rewrite them, and then there'll be a public hearing, and then we'll adopt them at a public hearing. And that will be done. Then we'll be done with that part of it. Then we move on.
What is the time frame on that again?
No time frame at all. We have,
No, I mean, there's a limit. I mean, it has to be done by a certain time.
we're talking about ordinance now, right? You're talking about zoning ordinance?
Either.
Zoning,
Oh,
no,
well,
not either.
regs-
The
regs you
regs,
could do whatever.
we can, that's what we
Yeah.
just decided to take up the reg because we need to take them up and just look at them and add things in. So there's no time limit on that. We can do them however we get to go, and everybody agrees on that. Again, it's laid out how we do it with public hearing, we pass it, and then we're done with that. Then we can go on to regulations after that, anywhere in the fall or something like that.
Okay.
The next meeting is July 14th. I will not be here.
You won't, I won't be here.
You
either.
will be here.
Let's not do it July 14th.
Yeah, it's probably too soon anyway.
Critical minutes.
It's-
I am not better.
No, so
I'll be here. when we visit, but, if there's gonna be a few people.
Not a planning board meeting, it looks like.
No, we have a meeting, we have applications.
we probably won't set another meeting with the Conservation Commission then until after the 14th. Maybe at our next meeting, we'll discuss it and then set when that meeting is gonna be up. So it might be like 3 meetings from now.
Yeah,
we might
whenever
get
it
together
makes
again.
sense that we've gotten some work done and can come back with something to show.
Yeah, so there's no set time. We'll just we'll let everybody know. Discuss it, I guess, right?
Thank you for your time.
Well, thanks for coming.
Thanks for coming.
Finally, some people at our meetings.
Yeah.
Can I have one?
Take a look at the, I know what I did here. Site plan review regulations, but we've been talking about those anyway, yeah. And any other business may be required from any of the board members or anybody? Any other comments from anybody before the planning board closes the meeting? Any other business that you might want us to talk about before we close the meeting? Other than that, then a motion to adjourn. Motion to adjourn from Michael York, second by Jane. Is there any further discussion? And all those in favor, indicate by saying aye. Aye. Okay, we're adjourned.